Now, it had this segment that was purported to show exactly what it was like to be on an LSD trip. I can only imagine that the point was that this was supposed to be horrifying and scare kids out of ever using drugs. But all I can tell you is it was beautiful and imaginative, and I thought it looked great. Well, all my friends and I agreed that we had had zero interest in drugs before, but having seen these health class films, we definitely wanted to try them. Well, eventually I grew up and I tried marijuana, at least, at parties. And it struck me as, well, maybe not as good as the health class films, but certainly very enjoyable. I should add, though, that I suppose I still qualify as a nerd in that marijuana has never been a really big part of my life. But certainly, as I told Grinspoon, I had no problem with Sagan's political stance about marijuana. It seemed very well reasoned, as did most of Sagan's political stances. But as I mentioned to Grinspoon, there is this tendency to boil any book, and certainly a biography, down to the 10-second revelation. And it's one thing for me to devote half a dozen pages in the book to exploring Sagan's elaborate intellectual rationale for using marijuana, but that doesn't prevent the media from excerpting this one factoid out of context and running the headline like "Top Astronomer, a Pothead." Well, the first direct feedback I got on my book was actually well before publication. I sent copies of the manuscript to some of Sagan's family and friends for review. Foremost among them certainly was Carl's widow, Anne Druyan. Now, Anne Druyan is a very open advocate of the decriminalization of marijuana. She actually sits on the board of NORML, the national organization to reform marijuana legislation. But I knew that she and Carl had had a falling out with the Grinspoons. In the last decade of his life, particularly, Carl could be an absolute terror to get along with. Now, I should add that not everyone felt this way, but certainly a statistically significant fraction of the people I interviewed did. And in many cases, Carl would terminate literally a decades-long friendship for reasons that to an outsider seemed pretty trivial. Well, the upshot was that he and Lester were scarcely talking in the last few years of Carl's life. So I wasn't quite sure how Druyan would take to this Mr. X material. Well, fortunately, she was totally supportive of my discussion of the whole marijuana issue, including Mr. X. Her only concern was one of balance. She wanted me and my readers to understand that marijuana was something Sagan used in moderation. And she gave me an example of that actually struck me as kind of funny at the time. She mentioned that Carl was always going on these overseas trips, and he obviously couldn't take the drug in his luggage when he had to go through customs. So she said that he would often go for weeks without marijuana. Well, that struck me as funny because, because it reminded me of the great W.C. Fields line about traveling the Sahara without a corkscrew and having to subsist for weeks on nothing but food and water. Now, I know you're saying that's flippant, and it is, but the more I thought about that, the more I realized Druyan's point. We live in a society where a drunk can be funny and lovable, but even the most temperate user of cannabis is apt to be viewed a lot less tolerantly. I can give you one example from my own experience. I once wrote a book on the great mathematician John von Neumann. Now, he was notorious for downing a pint of rye whiskey at one sitting and then stepping behind the wheel of his Cadillac. Now, fortunately, he didn't kill himself or anyone else, but he had accidents all the time. There is, to this day, an intersection in Princeton that the locals point out as Von Neumann Corner, where he had all these accidents. And as far as I can tell, no one who read the Von Neumann book had the slightest problem with that. If anything, it was a great story that humanized the guy. Well, between Mr. Davidson's book and my own, I think it's fair to say that the Sagan marijuana story has had its 15 minutes of media fame. The media seem to have found this mystifying, but the stories really weren't too negative. I suppose the unkindest thing I saw was in People magazine, which ran a review starting with the claim, "Carl Sagan was a pot-smoking, thrice-married, spoiled son." Even so, I have to admit that all three claims are pretty accurate. One reaction to the book that I didn't quite expect is that this whole marijuana story seems to have roughly split the skeptic movement, and as far as I can tell, split them about down the middle. About half the people I've spoken with have no problem with this whatsoever. The other half feel somehow betrayed. Among this latter group seems to be Sagan's good friend, James Randi. I read on an internet news group that Randi was saying that, well, first of all, he wasn't even sure whether to believe the marijuana stories, but in any case, he was very much against any mind-altering substances. Well, I think you could make a very strong and certainly self-consistent case supporting Randi's position. If you want to minimize all risk, I think it's obvious that it's best to use no recreational drugs at all. You may also feel that sober reality is good and any altered state of consciousness is less good. That's sort of a personal value judgment, and as such one that I don't think you can really criticize. But on that latter point, Sagan clearly differed from Randi. He liked the way marijuana made him feel, even felt that it somehow helped him with his work, and believed that that was justification for using it. Well, I think we have to accept that this is a point on which two very famously reasonable minds differ. But I'd like to close by posing the question of why there has been such an almost emotional reaction to this revelation, if you want to call it that Carl Sagan smoked marijuana. Well, I think the answer lies in the fact that drugs are more than chemicals. They carry a great deal of cultural baggage as well. To most of us, marijuana has certain implications or certain associations. It's probably associated with hippies, reggae, liberal politics, and above all, defiance, for it is illegal. As Sagan in particular was very aware, the youth culture that embraced marijuana was often very suspicious of science. It often linked it to the Vietnam War and the atomic bomb. Well, I suspect that this may be behind the reaction that I detect from some skeptics, that marijuana is incompatible with skepticism. Incompatible in a way that martinis aren't, I guess. But furthermore, marijuana carries the connotation of hedonism, which, as we all know, is a very dangerous thought in American society. We are back to this Mr. Spock idea that logic and emotion just don't mix. Well, Sagan sometimes struggled with that mixture himself. His first marriage was to Lynn Margulis, who of course is now hailed as one of the greatest of all living biologists. His second wife was Linda Salzman, an artist and later a TV writer. To some of Carl's friends, it seemed that in these two marriages, he had veered from an overwhelming emphasis on brains to an equally overwhelming emphasis on body. Carl saw a therapist as this second marriage faltered. The therapist finally told him that his problem was he had to decide between his brain and his prick. But Carl's reaction to that was, why can't I have both? Well, that type of conflict is something you see throughout Sagan's life, and I think throughout a lot of scientists' lives. In our society, pleasure and emotion are held to be at odds with the logic and skepticism that are the scientists' stock in trade. Now, some scientists respond by becoming emotionally stunted. I suppose I would have to place John von Neumann in that category. But then there are other scientists, like Sagan, who make a very conscious effort to strike a balance. In his Mr. X piece, Sagan wrote that he first tried marijuana at a time in his life when he realized that there was, quote, more to life than science. To Sagan, marijuana seems to have been emblematic of that other, not-so-rational side of life. And I suppose to a lot of people, not just scientists, that can be kind of a threatening idea. Now, Sagan was certainly not perfect at reconciling the intellectual and emotional sides of life, but he was wise enough to realize that he could have both. And I think that's an important key to understanding Sagan as a person and to understanding why people are upset by Mr. X. Thank you.